Hi everybody, and welcome back. So it's been a while. Now, I'm going to be filming a video today specifically for the Edexcel IGCSE course. However, this will probably be helpful for any exam board that is covering the unit of 1905 to 1924 Russia. Equally, if you're doing a slightly longer unit on Russia, I think this will still be really helpful because it's going to cover the essentially beginning of the course. So an introduction into what it was like living in Russia under the Tsars, some background into all the different words that you need to know to be able to describe this period of time, and a really good contextual understanding of why there were some long-term reasons that people were discontented, which means unhappy, living in Russia, and therefore why kind of the revolution really took hold in a country like Russia. So that's essentially what we're doing. Hopefully this will be helpful for you. So what I'm going to try and do throughout is specify what you might want to know for kind of a grade 5 or a grade 6 level, and then equally what's more the kind of 7 to 9 extension understanding, because some of some of the terminology, some of the context of this module can be really confusing, and I think it's helpful for you to think about, what am I aiming for? And if actually a really good outcome for you is a grade 6, then you don't want to get yourself kind of bogged down in all of the complex words and the complex kind of evidence and all that stuff that just isn't particularly helpful for you. So I'm going to try and differentiate, and I'll be using these two colors throughout to specify either different ways of thinking about something, or just kind of what's extension understanding for that 7 to 9 and what's kind of essential for everyone. So, what was Russia like? What was it like to live in Russia? Now, there are some words that you really need to understand. So the first is hierarchical, hierarchy. Okay, so that means a social tier system. People are arranged by a rank. So you have kind of the king at the top, working its way down through to kind of peasants or people who are farmers at the bottom. And everyone is very rigid. Rigid means stuck. So there's not very much movement going on. We call that movement up and down a social hierarchy, a rank, social mobility. So if you're able to work really hard in life and improve your circumstances, do better and get a really good job and, manage to improve your situation, then that would be called social mobility. You're able to be mobile, to move up and down the hierarchy. But Russia definitely lacked social mobility. You stuck to the class you were born into. 1.1% of society were nobility. So that's a very small amount, as you can see. And 82% were peasants. Now, peasants is a word for essentially farmers. So they were poor farmers who worked on the land. Now, slight complicated aspect with Russia, and this is definitely the 7 to 9 understanding, and I will be touching on it later, but I just want to clarify it now. In Russia, the word peasant is a relatively new term at the beginning of the 1900s, because what's previously happened is that people who worked the land in Russia were called serfs, and a serf was a form of enslaved peasant. Now, it's not quite the same as slavery as we might understand it in other contexts, like in America and in Britain, where people were kind of, really cruelly, forcefully taken from places like Africa and trafficked and sold into slavery. It's not quite the same. It's not quite as kind of brutal in a way, because people were very used to this lifestyle. They were born into it. They weren't allowed to leave the farms, so they lacked that level of freedom. However, they were able to kind of live in social groups. They weren't kind of sold, and their whole kind of livelihood, family life at risk all the time, as what happened in the other form of slavery I mentioned earlier. It was a much more kind of formalized living pattern. You lived on the farm, you stayed on the farm, you worked it until you died, and then your children kind of took over. It's not right, obviously. And that was called serfdom. Now, serfdom worked in Russia for a number of reasons. because they had lots of people who needed to work on farms. However, obviously, it also shouts of things like social inequality, a lack of freedom. You don't want to be stuck, or lots of people didn't want to be stuck. So they ended up, or Nicholas, who's the first Tsar that we look at, he ends up his grandfather. So Nicholas's grandfather, who's a man called Alexander II, frees the serfs, liberates or emancipates, which means to free the serfs. And that changes a lot of things in Russia. And we're going to be touching on this later because it does cause some other problems. But anyway, 82% of Russian people were peasants living on the land, not earning very much money, kind of living hand to mouth. That basically means you work to feed yourself, um, not having much to save, and not living a particularly enjoyable life. Now, this is an image that's often used about the hierarchy in Russia. It's a cartoon famously called The Wedding Cake. But as you can see, you see how it gets smaller as it goes towards the top, a bit like if you've learned about the English feudal system in medieval England. So smallest group of people at the top, the nobles and the Tsar and his kind of council. Most people had a very difficult life. That's really important to know. So whatever grade you're going for, understanding that life in Russia was really tough. If you weren't in that 1.1%, you were going to be working very, very hard, probably often in poverty, which means you're very hungry, and not, really struggling to kind of survive. Now, the next thing that's important to know about Russia is that it's very vast. Now, vast means it's large. Okay, now this is important because it's really hard, I think, for us to get our head around just how big Russia was. So on the map behind me, you can see the Russian Empire at this time. Now, it's humongous. Okay, it's today Russia is still the biggest country on Earth, and back then it also incorporated lots of other places like Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan. It covers 2 continents. This means it's extremely diverse. Diverse meaning different. The people that live there are very, very different. You've got people who are Muslim, you've got people who are Jewish, you've got people who are Christian, you've got Orthodox Christian, you've got so many different languages, you've got so many different styles of living, you've got so many different geographical environments, the very let me get my west and east right. Very east of Russia, Siberia, is essentially a frozen, barren wasteland for much of the year where it's incredibly cold and incredibly difficult to live. Whereas, you go to the west of Russia and it feels very much like kind of, Eastern Europe, in places like, well, obviously in Poland, but in places like St. Petersburg, you've got down in the south of Russia, places that feel quite Asian. So it's an incredibly large country. Now, obviously from that, you've got some other difficulties, communication, transport, food. Only certain parts of Russia had access to food. So, there's something called black soil regions, and black soil was really fertile land. Now, even though Russia is so big, so vast, not all of Russia is able to grow food. So transporting that food around the country, that in itself is very difficult. Now, another thing is this idea of localized governance. So local government might be where government is functioning from a local perspective, so in the local area, rather than in the central or centralized government, which you might have in smaller countries. So if you've got all these localized governments, then who's running them? And how are you going to make sure that they follow what you want them to follow? And, all these things that are very complicated to think about in terms of how we run the country effectively. It's 6,000 kilometers wide. Less than 50% of the people who live there identify as Russian. And as I said, they've got limited black soil regions. Now, the last thing to know in terms of these key terms about how, or about what Russia is like, is the fact it's autocratic. Now, autocratic, I think I might have skipped ahead here. Anyway, one other thing to note is it's also very nationalist. Now, nationalism is essentially being proud of your country, and what they did was, because only less than 50% of Russia was Russian at that time, they essentially did followed a policy called Russification, where they forced people from other places to essentially act Russian or adopt Russian cultures or practices to try and force people to be more Russian, to be more nationalist. Right, going back to autocratic. So this means that the royal family had all the power, and essentially was a government system, or a governing system, should I say, where all the power is with the royal family. They have the ability to make every decision. Nobody can stop them. There is no element of democracy. Now, the Russian royal family were the Romanovs. Here is a family tree. By the time of Nicholas, who is the Tsar that we look at, the Tsar that was Tsar during the Russian Revolution, Russia has been ruled by the Romanovs for almost 300 years. So as you can see, there is a pretty extensive family history here of this family governing Russia and having this autocratic ability to control it and decide every single thing that happens. It's absolutist, which means there's no democracy, there's no political parties, there's an imperial council who help to advise and help the Tsar to govern. However, that is made up of only nobility, so that will be his cousins, his close family members, or other elements of the nobility, that 1.1%. They believe that the Tsar was appointed by God. Now, this is really important because it links and it kind of helps us to understand why people in Russia went along with this system. So this is important for everyone to know. So the Tsar was appointed by God, and this was justified, so slightly higher understanding, in 1832 in a set of laws that were published called the Fundamental Laws. Article 1 explicitly justified that the Tsar was appointed by God. So if you want some really good evidence to prove that this was a system that was very much believed in and central to kind of the Russian governing system, that's a really good piece of evidence for you. Now, because he was appointed by God, this links us to the idea of orthodoxy. Now, orthodoxy or orthodox is, well, first of all, it's the type of faith that they had in Russia. So they followed, or at least the kind of, I guess I say central faith. I don't mean that in any way other than the fact that it was just followed by the royal family, and it was the one that was pushed by the government and the royal family. That's Christian Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. And it really supported this idea of an autocratic Tsar, because if you believe that the Tsar has been chosen by God, and if you are, very, very passionate about your faith, which many Russians were, you're going to believe that God has made the right choice, and therefore you are going to follow and trust in the system that has been essentially drilled into you is the one presented and chosen by the God that you believe in. So that is essentially how they kind of justified this autocracy, that God has chosen this family, God has chosen this man, he's been chosen to be put above the rest of us for very logical reasons that God will know about, and therefore we need to follow along with this. We need to kind of carry on and believe in it. This also supports nationalism because Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodox Christianity, supports the idea of Russianness. So you can see how all these things tie in together. We can also call this the divine right, the idea of kind of the divinely chosen God, the God divinely choosing the Tsar. And we can think about how orthodoxy reinforced autocracy. So I've just explained that. This also tried, or at least went a very long way in ensuring conformity. Now, conformity means people don't rebel. So, from what I've described, you might be thinking, this doesn't sound like a very great system. If you were not that 1.1%, why were people going along with this? Now, as I said, one thing was that orthodoxy, that strong belief in God, and the fact that God has chosen the Tsar. Now, there were many other things that the Tsar and the government did and had done for a very long time, which was there to ensure this conformity. So one reason, orthodoxy, I've just talked about that. The second one, there was no democracy. So there are just no other options. The Imperial Council, who is the only group of people with any say at all, and their role is simply advisory. They don't get a definitive say. They just get to advise. they're made up of nobility anyway, so they would never want to, recommend any other systems, because that would mean they would lose out as well. So they're tied to the Tsar. Their prosperity, their wealth, their success is tied to his. So they're going to be invested in ensuring the system continues to function. The next reason is censorship. Now, censorship means that you control what's presented in newspapers, you control the narrative or the message that's being published. So controlling newspapers, the media, things like that. Now, it is interesting because under Alexander II, who is the grandfather of Nicholas that I previously mentioned when I talked about the emancipation of the serfs, this is a little bit higher level, just to let you all know. I would only really focus in on this if you want that kind of 7 to 9. Now, under Alexander II, he introduced a series of reforms. So we see him as quite a reformist Tsar. He wanted to change things. He wanted to try and give people a bit more freedom, a bit more kind of liberty, a bit more, more prospects, things like that. He wanted to make the system a little bit more fair. Now, one thing he did, as I mentioned earlier, was he abolished serfdom. However, he did introduce a system of redemption dues. Now, when the serfs were abolished, obviously that wasn't kind of great for the landowners, because they were losing their body of workers potentially. And what they did to resolve this was they allowed the serfs to buy plots of land from the landowners. However, the serfs obviously didn't have saved up money to do this. So the government lent them or loaned them that money, and then said, well, you pay us back when when you've got your plot of land up and running. Now, what this became was something called redemption dues, where they were then paying for the next 49 years of their life, if they lived that long, which many didn't. So essentially, you're paying till you die. And you're paying very high interest as well. So many of these serfs, wow, we're free, fantastic. We've got our own plot of land. What a great start. And then you're tied into debt for essentially the rest of your life, which really wasn't very popular. The reforms, on top of kind of frustration and anger about serfdom, quite, I don't want to say the word ironic, because it's a very interesting thing, but the reforms allowed for a relaxation of some level of censorship. They also allowed more people to go to university and more people to study for the first time. Previously, that had been very tight knit. You went to school, you went to university if you were exceptionally wealthy. Whereas this promoted the idea of some poorer members of society who were very intelligent, or who wanted to access kind of higher learning, were able to go to university. Now, obviously, the kind of flip side of that is that if you go to school, if you go to university, you kind of learn things like critical thinking. You learn to question things. You might also be reading about systems in other countries, and you might realize that in almost every other country, especially at least in Europe, there was a level of democracy. There was France that had a revolution. England had somewhat of a revolution, even though the king had been reinstated. They still had far, far higher levels of kind of people power, people engagement in governance. And you start hearing about that and learning about that. And that's what created some resistance to kind of the Tsarist regime. And one of the most famous groups was the People's Will. Now, they were what we would call revolutionary socialists. So, alongside learning about these other systems and democracy, you're also going to be learning about other forms of kind of ideology, like more left-wing thinking, for example, socialism. And they actually were involved in an assassination of Alexander II. So, ironically, I said I wasn't sure if I wanted to use that word, but I guess it is ironic. He introduced these reforms which kind of led to his downfall. And he was killed in this assassination. Now, the reason this is interesting, if you're really going for those highest grades, is that what ends up happening is Alexander is essentially blown up in a kind of explosion when he's out in his carriage, and he's then taken back to the palace in a very, very, very injured state. He's still alive at this point, and he's kind of, yeah, I'm not going to go into his injuries. It's not very nice. And he dies in, quite a lot of agony. And both his son and his grandson, so his son Alexander III and his grandson Nicholas, watch this happen. And this has a very scarring impact on both of those men as czars, as rulers. They equate, which you can understand why, the reforms, giving the people a bit of freedom with that kind of image of this very traumatic scene, watching your father and your grandfather kind of die in pain and agony with, the injuries that he'd sustained in this attack. And that had a very profound meaning, very impactful impact on the way that they saw autocracy. And it really reinforced for both of them that autocracy was the only way of ruling. So when Alexander III came into power, he actually undid, or he reversed, a lot of those reforms that his father had put in place. So under Alexander II, we have more freedoms. Under Alexander III, we have less freedoms. So that's kind of another reason, kind of historically, why by this point of Nicholas, people are getting very frustrated. Reason 4, of kind of controlling the people, we had the secret police, who were called the Okhrana, who would encourage people to inform on each other, who would be, listening in, who would follow people and find out about kind of things going on that shouldn't be. They banned public gatherings of more than 12 people. And we'd want to use the word repression. They were very repressive meaning kind of crushing down on people. 300,000 people are sent to Siberia. So Siberia is over, when I talked about Russia being vast, Siberia is all the way to the east in that kind of very snowy, icy region where it's very difficult to live. And Siberia contained lots of kind of prison camps or gulags where people would be sent to work and just essentially be in a kind of a prison where you just couldn't escape from. So to summarize, Russia was hierarchical, vast, autocratic, nationalist, and followed orthodoxy. And those words are really, really important in how to understand why things start to go wrong in Russia. Connections. So orthodoxy to autocracy, you've got the fact that God chose the Tsar. Therefore, that reinforced the fact there was no social mobility because God had set the system and God had chosen the place for everyone. So therefore, why would we move? You've got repression, which ensured this autocracy stayed. And we've got the fact that we've had the legacy of Alexander II going into Alexander III, going into Nicholas II, who is the Tsar for this part of the course. Now, Nicholas himself also was a problem. He was very quiet and shy, nothing wrong with those characteristics. However, if you are the Tsar of Russia, the Emperor of Russia, they're not the best characteristics to have had. You needed to be this big authority chosen by God to play along to all of these kind of beliefs that God has chosen you to rule over this vast nation. He needed to be a big character, and both his father and his grandfather were very big, strong characters. He actually experienced probably what today we would call bullying from his father, who constantly told him he was too weak to rule and he was, feeble and pathetic, and lots of these very kind of mean words that his father used about him because he was of a very different personality than his father, who was kind of big and bold and confident. He really enjoyed being in his kind of summer home, which was the Levada Palace, outside of the city. Now, again, nothing really wrong with that. However, if you are, again, the Tsar of Russia and you are constantly away from your people, from your kind of palace, it causes problems. His father also died very unexpectedly. Nicholas wasn't ready or expecting at this point to have to take on the throne. He didn't have the best education for a Tsar. He was kind of educated in a very British style. Again, nothing wrong with that. But that focused mainly on kind of being a gentleman, the idea of how to dance properly at parties and all of those things, which if you were an English gentleman in the early 1900s would probably have suited you very well and helped you very well. But to be the Tsar of Russia, which was a very different type of country at that time, it didn't really help him. He was only 26, which again might seem quite old, depending on how old you are. But to suddenly inherit the biggest empire in the world is very, very young. He completely rejected reform. He was very autocratic. He very, very, very wholeheartedly believed in autocracy for the reasons that or at least for one of the reasons I've just described. As I said before, he wasn't educated properly. He was also married to a German princess. Her name was Alexandra. And she was one of the granddaughters of Queen Victoria. She also believed very, very much in autocracy. So they kind of reinforced each other on that point. And as we'll find out later in the course, that has lots of other complications to it as well. He was also very, very, very much in love with her, which was very unique for the time. Marriages were made on political relationships. They weren't love marriages. And while we would definitely like to, think that's really nice for them, they actually had a loving relationship. The downside of this was that he kind of retreated from court a lot to be with her. They went to their summer palace often, and that kind of love he had for his wife and his family was more important to him than his job. And again, I think today we would think that's a good thing, but being the Tsar of Russia, that was a big, big responsibility. And I think all of these things connected add up to the fact that he probably just wasn't really the right person for the job at that time. Okay, so some reasons why people were unhappy. Now, we have touched on these, but just to clarify, just to bring everything together. So peasants, who were the poor farmers, they lived mainly on subsistence farming. That is where you literally make enough food to kind of survive. You don't have much left over. You don't really go to market and sell your produce. You're just creating or growing food to live. They mainly used what we would describe as inefficient methods. So inefficient meaning not very good, not very productive. It wasn't the best solution or the best option. They farmed in very narrow strips, which meant you weren't able to kind of optimize or put your time to best use. Emancipation of the serfs, so I've just talked about that, but obviously the redemption dues were very difficult for people. That happened in 1861, so they're still feeling a lot of the effects of that. In addition, at this point, we have had a rising population. So we now have more people depending on the land. Now, the more people you have, the more mouths you have to feed, and the kind of more difficult food becomes. As I said, there's not that many black soil regions, so food was becoming kind of a more ever-present concern and getting more expensive. If there's more demand for something, it gets more expensive. Now, another thing is the Mers. Now, Mers were peasant councils. So this was a group of people from the local villages who would essentially make a lot of the big decisions about the village and how it was run. These were often quite male-dominated, very hierarchical. Kind of the village elders would make these decisions, and it was quite a brutal way of life. It was very much eye for an eye in terms of crime and punishment and the way things were done, and everything was dealt with within the village. It wasn't really taken to a higher level. It's not like you had things like courts and proper kind of systems of justice. If you were caught stealing, you were literally tied to your horse and dragged around until you died. It was a brutal kind of pretty rough and ready way of living. Now there were also the Zemstva, which were the district councils. So if you want that higher grade, you really do need to know these two terms, the Mers and the Zemstva. So the Zemstva were district councils who were kind of like a form of localized government, and they were made up of nobility. Now, at this time, we had a huge amount of what we would call rural to urban migration. Now, that basically means that people moved to the cities. We had the creation of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which today is still running, still very famous, and essentially started connecting Russia east to west for the first time. So you can see on the map where that railway went. In addition, we had a very big move towards industrialization. Now, industrialization is a process whereby you essentially start building factories and you transition your country from an agricultural country or a farming country into a country that is making its money, its profit from industry and producing goods and selling things, abroad, and optimizing and having factories, and most people are working in factories. So the national output of goods and products rises by 98%. However, for the people working and living in these factories, the conditions were extremely terrible. So people were, as I said before, becoming more literate. So that means they were learning how to read, or becoming more educated for the first time. And that had kind of slowly increased across the last kind of couple of decades. And now they're living in very, very terrible conditions. So they're going to be able to start questioning and discussing and talking about how unhappy they are, basically. If you put people together and then put them through very difficult things, very, very long work days, really rubbish food, not very nice sleeping conditions, they're going to start moaning. It's just kind of normal human behavior, isn't it? So that's what happened. You had lots and lots of people moving to the cities, working in these not very nice conditions, who then started talking to each other as they lived and worked right next to each other about how unhappy they were. So 58% of Russia was now literate. They had absolutely no representation or trade unions, so they had no way of kind of representing their interests or saying what they wanted changed. Trade unions are groups or bodies who represent workers. So today, a trade union might try to get better pay for a certain group of people, or better working hours, or something like that. But these were all banned under the repression that the Tsarist regime had. By kind of 1905, St. Petersburg now had 2 million people. So it's really overcrowded. People are living in very terrible conditions, and it's just not a very nice place to be for a lot of people, not for everyone. We also have a growing middle class. Now, a growing middle class were mainly people who were benefiting from industrialization. So if you've learnt about industrialization in England, for example, you will know there was that growing body of people who were essentially not landed, or they didn't have titles. They weren't kind of that old money as you might have under earlier periods like the Tudor period or the Stuart period, but they were people who were taking advantage of the kind of economical situation. They were making lots of money out of trading abroad, or they were running a factory which they were making profit on, and they'd built another factory because they were pretty kind of clever about what to do with it, and they knew how to kind of make more money, basically. So they were becoming wealthier, but they weren't given any of the rights that came with being wealthy that the nobility had. So in Russia, the problem was this growing middle class had money, but no representation, no form of voting, or accessing those higher levels of kind of power or government. So to summarize, Russia was hard to rule because of the geography, as we've talked about. It was vast and it was diverse. Vast, large, diverse, people were very different. This meant that nationalism was pushed. In addition, there was a lack of representation and rights. We had autocracy and a belief in the divine right. In addition, Nicholas was not a very good Tsar, which meant that if you have a system of autocracy, it just didn't really work. This was all reinforced through Orthodoxy, the Russian faith. Finally, because of varying events leading up to this point, there was a growing demand for more. The middle class wanted more representation. The working class, who had moved from who had been serfs, who'd been emancipated, who'd become peasants, who'd now moved to the cities and were working in factories, wanted better conditions, wanted more rights and trade unions. So poor conditions, better education. The earlier reforms under Alexander II had kind of lit a fire in people. It's much harder to lose rights rather than to just never have them. So now these people had rights and then lost them. Now they want them back. And this was all reinforced through autocracy. So all of that, hopefully, has given you an explanation of why it was difficult living in Russia in 1905. Now, this is obviously just in kind of an introductory video, an opening, but I think many of these terms, many of this context is really, really important in understanding what happens next in terms of Russia and the build up to that revolution. So hopefully that's been helpful for you, and I will see you again soon.